The Emperor of Mankind has shaped the galaxy of Warhammer 40k more than any other individual. The Imperium of Man, the dominant force in the galaxy, was a product of his Great Crusade and his Primarch project, and his wider millennia-long program to unify humanity. And without it, humanity would have been doomed to destruction. Right? I mean, that's what the Emperor says, but is that actually true? Did you know Tale of Four Gamers is now over on Arbeiterian's Precinct House? There's a link in the thing below. So, the plans of the Emperor of Mankind are broadly familiar to most 40k fans. During the Age of Strife, when humanity was isolated and at risk of being destroyed by Xenos empires, the Emperor arose on Terra and led a galactic unification project, the Great Crusade, which, by diplomacy or by force, brought together the scattered human empires, pooled their military and technological resources, and destroyed the evil Xenos, leaving humanity, even in the wake of the Horus heresy that followed, as the dominant force in the galaxy. And according to the Emperor, this was all necessary. Without him and his plans, humanity would have been picked apart by emerging Xenos empires, or lost to the worship of the dark powers of chaos, playthings for the demons of the warp. Yes, the Great Crusade involved the conquest, subjugation, and genocide of thousands of worlds, and we know that in the end, the Emperor's plans were only semi-successful, leading to the horrific and repressive Imperium of 40k, but it had to be done. It was the best chance available to humanity at the time. At least that's what the Emperor, beloved by all, said. So, is that true? Was the Emperor right? Was the Imperium and its brutal and swift conquest of the galaxy the only way? This is a subject debated a lot online. Not only the morality of doing it, but also the question of, well, was what he said correct? The Great Crusade certainly involved lots of death and destruction, and the Emperor was no democratically elected leader. He was an authoritarian tyrant who insisted every human in the galaxy follow his plans or be killed. The internet is full of fan theories that the Emperor was secretly out for his own gain, or that humanity would have done just fine without the Imperium, or that even if it was the only way, the Emperor was still morally wrong to do the things he did. He was a liar, a hypocrite, a ruthless superweapon who wanted to be God. There's always lots of discussion on that topic. But what do the books actually say? Was the Imperium, the one that the Emperor planned for in the 30th millennium, actually the only solution? And to answer that, we first have to go through a brief history of the new man himself and the development of those plans. So I'll launch into this with a little bit of a disclaimer. The history of the Emperor and the formation of his grand plan is a little bit disjointed, and we do not have the whole story. We're told it in fragments spread across more than 100 books, so we need to do a little bit of work to piece it all together. There's no perfect timeline of history here, so I've tried to stitch all those fragments together, hopefully without too much speculation creeping in. The Emperor, as far as we know, was born in around 8000 BC in what is now Anatolia, which is pretty close to where the first human civilizations actually were. There are two possible origins listed. In the first, the Emperor was a Gestalt being. The shaman, the early psychers of humanity, had guided prehistoric humans through the previous millennia, the shaman's spirits, which were very strong because of their psychic power, returning to the warp when they died, and then being reincarnated into a new body soon afterwards, and that way their accumulated knowledge would build over generations. But the warp had recently become so turbulent, what with all the sentient species existing and, having emotions, that the shaman's souls could no longer reincarnate before they were eaten in the warp by demons. So they all decided that they would die at the same time so they could combine all their spirits into a single new man who would be immortal and powerful enough to resist the warp. And the Emperor was that person, born to apparently normal people in a farming village in the ancient Near East. That's the first version of the story. The second, which may or may not contradict it, briefly hinted at by Ol Person Immortis, is that the Emperor was simply the first psyker, the first shaman, with nothing known beyond that. He was a perpetual, an immortal human, something hinted as being the next evolutionary step for humanity. Was there anyone who could go up against him? Ol shrugged. There were some, but he was the first. You mean the first psyker? The first witch, the first wizard, sorcerer, shaman, druid? The first. There were others who were different, but none like him, not in the beginning. What changed? He did. He was weaker than he is now, much weaker, but always stronger than anyone else. People change. People stay the same. He was always driven. Always. Early in his life, his father was murdered by his uncle. That wasn't the first murder. Humans have been betraying each other for ages, but it was the first he witnessed, and he took revenge, stopping his uncle's heart. In a flashback shown in Master of Mankind, the Emperor says he considers that this is where his philosophy began. Every village already had leaders. Every family had patriarchs and matriarchs. I speak of kings, givers of law, rulers of cultures, not merely those who give orders, but those whose decisions keep a civilization bound together. This was the night I realized that mankind must be ruled. It couldn't be trusted to thrive without a master. It needed to be guided and shaped, bound by laws, and set to follow the course laid by its wisest minds. So the Emperor comes to believe that humanity needs order, needs law, and rulers who impose law in order to develop civilization, and he goes out into the world and starts doing that stuff. Some of this we know about from misremembered legends from ancient times, and we also know that at some point he does become a powerful ruler. The Perpetual Erda says that many Perpetuals in the early days were some sort of warlord. In the time of the first cities, he was a warlord even then, a king, and he was doing exactly what most of my kind do. He had taken on the stewardship of the human race. He had a greater understanding of the universe than anyone, such was his power. He saw the dangers of the warp, the fragility of humanity, the recurring flaws of our species, credulity, anger, false faith, yearning, everything that was terrible and also wonderful about humanity. When I met him, he'd already begun on his path to shepherd mankind towards a brighter future. At some point, he meets Ol Person, who is the oldest known Perpetual, and with Ol as his war master, he defeats and destroys the Tower of Babel, a great tower raised by sorcerers who had unlocked the entire lexicon of Enuncia, the primordial language of creation. The sorcerers had intended to use that language to raise up humanity, but it turns out that merely knowing Enuncia is dangerous. This will be a theme. Cities turn to ash and salt, predator ideas. Words that once you heard them would sink into the brain and kill you if you started to think the wrong things. The Emperor casts down the tower and kills the sorcerers, but he keeps the knowledge for himself, stating that even then he can see the shadow of the future, that humanity would be threatened way more than just from a single tower, and that it would be ridiculous to cast aside a potential tool that could save it. Tools, said the man, weapons, knowledge. We cannot throw aside any of it. You are right, we cannot see the clear path to salvation, but we will be able to. This is a step. There shall be other steps and other paths, and we shall take them in turn as we must. This, though, is the first real step. Come, we're fighting a war the end of which no one else shall see. We cannot turn from the weapons that we have, nor those that Providence provides. A glass to see further, a word to open hearts, a sword to kill unborn gods. The man in the crown nodded and gestured to the symbol-covered pillars and walls. Take this knowledge and the fate changes. Leave it and it unravels. It's a simple choice. But there are no simple choices, said Ol. But there are, said the man. It's just the consequences that are complicated. So the myth of the Tower of Babel dates from about 4200 BC, so this is quite early in the Emperor's life, and we have codes of laws in real history from about 2000 BC, so evidently the Emperor's ideas spread to some degree. In these excerpts, the Emperor already seems to have a level of foresight, psychic precognition, but we also know that in 40k, foresight is not very reliable. You can often see the potential results, but not what decisions you have to make to get there. We also know that he was one other ancient ruler, Alexander the Great, who in 323 BC created the largest empire ever seen at the time, which stretched from Europe all the way to northern India. In a fevered memory, Horus says that the emperor once told him that he was Alexander, who wept when he reached the banks of the Hyphasis, the Beas River, when he found there was no more that he could conquer. Anyway, he came to the river Hyphasis and crossed it and wept, for, as he put it, there were no new worlds to conquer. Beside the Hyphasis, my father wept because at the time he felt he had accomplished all he could. His ambitions were achieved, and the revelation shook him. He was not proud or satisfied. He was bereft. In fact, the original quote from Plutarch says he wept because he realized there were infinite worlds to conquer, which also makes sense because shortly after this, the emperor discovered the ancient Xenos device known as the Golden Throne under the sands of Asia, or maybe a device that inspired or became part of the Golden Throne, it's unclear. This also tracks the Golden Throne will eventually be sited under the Himalayas under his palace, which is exactly where Alexander got to when he had his realization. And then in history, Alexander dies and his empire was immediately broken up by his squabbling generals, which does reinforce the emperor's original argument a bit. The minute he wasn't there to rule, apparently off studying the Golden Throne, the empire fell apart. That's the last we have of the emperor being an actual ruler. After this, coinciding with the discovery of the Golden Throne, he seems to move into the background, and we're told he's guiding humanity without directly ruling over it for thousands of years. At some point in the Middle Ages, he briefly emerges as a golden knight who defeats a silvery worm-like construct in modern-day Libya, and then imprisons it on Mars. This is implied to be a shard of the ancient Catan, the Void Dragon, and this event gives rise to the myth of St. George and the Dragon, where it's confused with the historical St. George, who likely existed a lot earlier. Perceiving that the dragon was helpless, though not dead, the knight untied a long white banner from his shattered lance and bound it around the neck of the monster. With the dragon subdued, the knight turned to the astounded handmaidens and the people of the city who streamed from its gates in a riot of adulation. The knight raised a hand to quiet them, and such was his presence and radiance that all who beheld him fell silent. "The dragon is defeated," cried the warrior. "But it's beyond even my power to destroy, so I shall drag it in fetters from this place and bind it deep in the darkness, where it will remain until the end of all things." Other than that, he disappears from human history. Humanity grows, takes over the Earth, expands into the stars, discovers the warp, and begins the age of technology. According to Erda again, speaking way later, at all points during this, he's trying to hasten humanity along its development. He saw his own power and tried to use it. He tried to steer mankind towards a better future. He tried to raise the human race up to achieve its potential. And of course, because of his power, he was rather more effective than most of us. At some point in the age of technology, he travels on a generation ship with another perpetual, Olivia Sureka, with a human expedition to colonize the world of Molech, which happens to contain a mysterious portal into the warp. Nobody knows exactly what he does in there, but he comes out way more powerful. And there are numerous hints that he got more knowledge, or stole something, or did some deal with the powers of the warp, or gained control over it. Whenever it's mentioned, there are references to the Greek myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. "You have brought the emperor face to face with chaos first found, closer than when he sat upon the throne or walked the shrieking halls of the webway, perhaps closer even than when he last faced the four and took their fire from them on Molech." Again, we don't know exactly what happens here. It's one of the great mysteries of the setting. He gains mastery of the warp, and then that comes up a few different ways later in the story. During the Age of Technology, a few other things happen. There's mention of rampant genetic engineering as humanity is modified into a load of weirder and weirder things. There's also the vague implication that democracy isn't a thing anymore and hasn't been for a while. From the very few hints we get, they imply that it's all techno-rulers or warlords rather than enlightened republics. Also, humanity has started to evolve psychically, which is very dangerous. Psychers are popping up and they have no idea how to control their powers. And then very finally in this period, there is the development of AI, which leads to a massive cybernetic revolt, which almost wipes out humanity. How much of that the Emperor's involved in, We don't know. Erda again mentions that a lot of wars are fought in disguise between the Emperor and other Perpetuals trying to stop his plans, but we don't know any more than that. Some of us joined him, others decided not to, some of us fought him. Several of the greatest conflicts in world history were caused by rival Perpetuals trying to thwart his program. This is followed quickly by the Age of Strife, in which the Eldari fall begins. The build-up to this clouds the warp, making warp travel impossible, and with no interstellar travel, humanity fractures, and all the problems we just said, especially the genetic engineering and the rogue psyker ones, get way worse. Worlds are swallowed by psychers gone wrong. Warlords turn humans into weird biomechanical monsters. Terra itself devolves into techno-barbarian nation-states, making use of horrific weapons and dark sorcery to wage their wars, and across the galaxy, any surviving humanity becomes a load of isolated civilizations that sometimes even forget where they came from. Then, after 5,000 years, the fall of the Eldar actually happens, the Chaos God Slaanesh is born, the Eldar Empire is wiped out, leaving the Eye of Terror, a massive rift in reality, and the warp storms are blown away, leaving everyone else in the galaxy free to expand again. But the Emperor, in some of the oldest lore out there from Slaves to Darkness in the 80s, foresaw the fall of the Eldar and resolved that humanity was approaching a tipping point, in danger of being destroyed in a few different ways. First, when the warp storms come down, there was going to be a galactic free-for-all as various Xenos empires and species expand, and humanity needs to be ready to win that and not get immediately eaten by aliens, ideally ending up in a position where it can never again be in danger of Xenos conquest. Or, I guess, in danger of being screwed over by some Xenos race doing the same thing as the Eldar and ripping a hole in reality. Then, now safe from real space domination, humanity needs to be able to evolve psychically in a way that doesn't result in them doing the same as the Eldar. Ideally, safe from as much of the predation of the warp as possible. So, along with a few other Perpetuals, Malcador and Erda at the start, he embarks on a great plan, or rather, a series of plans within plans, with contingencies and backups and fail-safes all over the place in the hope that one path will work. Again, it's not clear if this is just part of his ancient program to elevate humanity or a new urgent rush for it, but it's this plan that we're talking about in the video. The plan has a number of different parts, all of which are reliant on each other. First, he decides to try being a leader again, to unify humanity under his banner, starting with Earth. Ideally, that's done by diplomacy, but it has to happen quickly, before the warp storms come down and leave humanity vulnerable, so conquest is going to be a thing too, and that's going to require armies, and also making sure all the horrific old weapons of the Dark Age of technology are firmly in the Imperium's hands and nobody else's. Then, when the warp storms come down, those armies and their forbidden weapons need to be able to go into the galaxy and do the same thing. Unite all the strands of humanity, leaving none that are outside the control of the Imperium, and pour all their resources and their lost technology together to make sure humanity are left in the dominant military position in the galaxy, safe from alien conquest forevermore. Secondly, while doing that, he kind of needs to stabilize the human genome. Humanity had been mutated in all sorts of horrific, unstable ways by unscrupulous rulers over thousands of years. And so the plan was to try and stabilize that and establish a reliable, robust genetic base again. Just like with the horrific Dark Age weapons, the Emperor doesn't mind using genetic engineering to do his conquering. He creates Custodes, Thunder Warriors, and Space Marines, and he even uses that mastery of the warp to create Primarchs to lead them. But those are all implied to be tools, means to an end. It's regular baseline humans who are intended to inherit the Imperium. Again, I'll reiterate that this has to happen quickly, before any other species or empire does it, and the Emperor will use any tool to get there first, even if those tools need to be discarded afterwards. He creates the Thunder Warriors, brutal and savage armies that are required to conquer the horrors of Terra, but he then wipes them out because once that was done, they were just a bit too dangerous to have standing around. He's ruthless about that sort of thing. Okay, third, He needs to stop people worshipping the warp. As far as the Emperor is concerned, all religious worship will eventually lead to worshipping chaos, because that's what works, even if your intentions are good. He tells a custodian the story of the priest king of Molland Sen, who started out trying to help his people, but eventually turned his realm on Terra into a horrific chaos cult. Superstition and ignorance always attract the warp's denizens, continued the Emperor, for the core of religion is the twinned principle of arrogance and fear. Fear of oblivion, fear of an unfair life and an arbitrary universe, fear of there simply being nothing, no great and grand scheme to existence, the fear, ultimately, of being powerless. In fact, it's not just enough to stop worshipping the warp. Knowledge of the warp needs to be quite heavily guarded since, a bit like Enuncia, knowing about the warp can corrupt you. And if knowledge of the warp was widely taught, inevitably some humans would try and use it for personal gain. Humans are like that. However, realizing that a belief in something higher is very useful to unite people, he replaces religious worship by a belief in the manifest destiny of humankind, the glorious project of the Imperium. You can have faith in humanity, in the project. Loken says as much right at the start of Horus Rising. I am a man of faith, he said softly, and that faith is the truth of the Imperium. And despite being in the shadows for millennia, the Emperor emerges and becomes that figurehead, the great, giant, shining golden figure of awe, removed from and set above humanity, but crucially, not a god, just publicized as the greatest human, the most powerful psyker. All person and Malcador and the Emperor all separately state that this is a performance. The man I once knew, he didn't really care for majesty or material riches. It was all just a means to an end. Everything was. The palaces, the titles, even the face he wore, they meant nothing to him. All that mattered was what they meant to other people. They were just aspects, signifying devices to carry authority. He had to look the part. To rule a galaxy, he needed a palace like this. I assure you, he would have as soon lived a monk in some stone cell or in a hut on a barren moor. He needed nothing, but no one would have taken him seriously. This monstrous, tasteless edifice is simply the natural conclusion of his progress. The Emperor doesn't really enjoy it, but it gives humanity a focus, and it also allows him to more easily control those Primarchs he created to lead the armies. We see later that they don't really like being told what to do by regular humans who are way less powerful than them. I defy you, Horus spat at the Sigillite. You and this shadowy council of bureaucrats, your kind's not fit to rule anything. An Imperium ruled by men would be exactly what your father intended, Malcador murmured. All this, the removal of religion, the casting of himself as leader, the marketing of all of this, is called the Imperial Truth. Fourthly, he has to control all the Psykers. Humanity was sprouting more and more Psykers, and they can be really dangerous without proper training, so Psykers needed to be controlled, ideally captured and funneled into useful Imperial institutions. Along with controlling genetic mutation, this becomes another of the big laws of the Imperium that the states it takes over are forced to adhere to. And then lastly, the only part of this that actually requires the direct involvement of the Emperor: stop using warp travel. Navigators have been around since the Dark Age of technology and would still be needed for this conquest, so he creates the Astronomicon on Terra to make them more effective, and he starts training astropaths to help with communication. But the real goal was that humanity should take over the webway from the recently destroyed Eldar, which would make travel and communication a hell of a lot safer. To do this, the Golden Throne had maybe been relocated, but certainly augmented, in order to create a path into the webway from a portal under the Himalayas on Terra, under his palace. The bridging bit between that portal and the webway itself would have to be built by humans from psi-reactive machinery, but once that bridge was constructed, humans would be able to spread through the webway, make it safe, and stop using warp travel. Given that this is a massive psychic challenge, it seems to be the bit that the Emperor is most likely to need to do himself. Remember, he's created 20 loyal magic super generals to do the real space conquering bit. Lastly, and I've said it already, but all of this had to happen quickly. It seems that the plan was for it to take no more than a few hundred years, and there are a number of possible reasons suggested for this. First, other alien species, or maybe some other warp-tainted humans, might try and do the same thing when the storms come down and build their empire first. Secondly, the warp and the powers of chaos would be reeling in the wake of the birth of Slaanesh, and the Emperor wanted to get as much as possible done before they realised what he was doing. There is still this idea that the Emperor, when he was on Molech, played some trick or did some deal with chaos and is now going back on it, and he wanted to get all this stuff done before they realise. And lastly, whatever he did back then, it seems like it's causing the Emperor to lose his humanity. We don't really know what this means, but the implication is that his mastery of the warp allows him to draw almost limitless power from it, but the more he does that, the more he sort of unravels or becomes inhuman. So by setting all this in motion, possibly creating the Primarchs, possibly the bridging of the webway, by grabbing the power needed to do all that, he also puts himself on some sort of clock. He's taken to referring to them as his sons. Can you imagine that? Neither could I until I heard it from his own lips. There might even be some lingering attachment there, though how long that will last I cannot say. Valdor hesitated. Then his human sentiments, they're still ebbing? As he predicted, all things have their price. All of this is still a long shot. The Emperor and Malcador are not omnipotent. Prophecy in 40k is not a very reliable art. So in attempting this, they are above all pragmatic. They put in motion a million contingency plans, set up loads of stuff they think might be useful, and of course, they capitulate sometimes. They're happy to make exceptions to some of their big, publicised laws if it pushes the plan forward overall. For example, they allowed the Mechanicum to keep their religion because it doesn't seem very worrying as far as religions go, and because Mars was more useful as an ally. The early Imperium couldn't really afford the delay that a war with Mars would cause. They're also aware of the scale of the endeavour and the immoral things they're going to have to do to make it happen. In their opinion, this is still the only way to really guarantee a safe future for humanity. But it's going to involve a lot of war and a lot of death. It is a conquest of the galaxy. They will have plans that happen in secret. They'll likely tell lies to preserve the appearance of the glorious Imperium and keep people united. Like any nation, there will be conspiracies and cover-ups, whatever gets the job done. And those will probably cause friction, and that friction might need to be dealt with. Their contingencies even plan, to a degree, for the idea that some of the Primarchs might rebel, and how they might deal with that. For the Emperor and Malcador, all of that is justified by the fact that it's necessary. The survival of humanity rests on this plan. There are occasional mentions of what the intended future will be like after all this is achieved, and speculation about what it might entail. Will the Emperor stay in power or disappear? There are hints he might not be around forever. Will the Space Marines and the Primarchs still be needed at all? Rob Ute Gilliman thinks that the Primarchs and Space Marines will serve a governing role in the future. Magnus's destiny is to sit on the Golden Throne, but it's also clear that the move is generally towards civilian human government. Unspoken understanding flowed between Magnus and the Emperor. Everything Magnus had done was laid bare, and everything the Emperor planned flowed into him. He saw himself atop the Golden Throne, using his fearsome powers to guide humanity to its destiny as rulers of the galaxy. He was to be his father's chosen instrument of ultimate victory. It broke him to know that his unthinking hubris had shattered that dream. The Emperor never reveals what the full plan is once humanity's survival is achieved and they're safe to mature into a psychic species. We only know that the Emperor wants to ensure that it happens. What we do know is that the Imperium that we recognise from 40k isn't it, because these plans don't all work out. The Imperium of 40k is not what the Emperor set out to create in 30k. So, that's his plan. What actually happened? Well, the warp storms come down, the Great Crusade starts, and Malcador and the Emperor begin the gamble. There are, of course, some problems. There's an early rebellion, the Palace Coup, when the first Grand Provost Marshal discovers that the laws the Imperium says it rules by, that it's united humanity under, don't actually apply to the highest powers in the land. But the biggest problem is when both the Perpetual Erda and the geneticist Ammar Astarte, horrified at the scale of these plans and the death it involves, try to sabotage the Space Marine project. Apparently they thought the Emperor was taking too many risks, which I think is probably true. The question is, are they justified? He was taking risks. One by one, Perpetuals allied to him slipped away. He was glad to see the back of them, I think. He was tired of their objections and weary of their caution. He wanted results. He became angry with minds that could not match his speed of thought and his genius. So most of us left him. Ammar Astarte eventually tries to sabotage the Space Marine project, which causes massive setbacks in early Space Marine production, and Erda causes the Primarchs to be scattered through the warp to various planets across the galaxy. So the Great Crusade has to start without its main generals. And I think this is probably the single biggest problem that screws up the Emperor's gambit. The Primarchs are not just useful as generals to go and do the unifying while the Emperor does the webway bit, but also because they stabilise the Space Marine Legion's gene seed. If they had stayed on Terra, not only would there be 20 Imperium-raised superhuman generals from the very, very start, but also the initial Astartes legions could have been a lot bigger. Them being scattered is a massive delay to a project that we already know has a time limit. The early Crusade then has to be led by the Emperor in person. We don't know if that was the plan, who is also trying to find his Primarchs so that he can get the plans back on track. And those Primarchs have now been raised in all sorts of human societies, some of them horrific and damaging, many of them not really tallying with the Emperor's beliefs. Those who are found first get a lot of training and one-on-one time with the Emperor to acclimatise to the Imperium. But as the Crusade goes on and time runs out, there's less and less time available for that. The scattering of the Primarchs is a massive problem. However, despite that, the Crusade mostly does achieve the goals he sets out. Human societies are united, mostly willingly or through diplomacy, sometimes through force, which is obviously disproportionately featured in our books about wars. Aliens are killed. In fact, the Imperium faces at least 2 giant expansionist alien empires that seem to have the same idea, and it just about wins against them. And after 200 years, the plan has broadly worked, and at that point, due to a build-up of all the above pressures, the Horus heresy happens. It's worth saying that the majority of Primarchs who turn against the Emperor were those later found ones, shoved in charge of their legions in a rush as the Crusade neared completion. Anyway, the Horus Heresy happens, a rebellion by the Primarchs that was on a scale way bigger and more destructive than Malcador or the Emperor seem to have ever envisaged. During this, Horus also goes to Molech and gets some of that warp power-up. We don't know if it's the same one. Magnus accidentally destroys the Webway project by doing nothing wrong, so the Emperor is then confined to the throne for the rest of the war, holding the warp breach shut, and after a decade-long war that sets the galaxy on fire, eventually, Horus and the Emperor fight. In order to beat Super Horus, the Emperor initially attempts to draw a ton of power from the warp, more than he ever has tried to do before, but this actually turns out to be a trick. It seems that if he does this, he'll become so powerful and so inhuman that he'll turn into an entity called the Dark King and destroy everything. So, Ol Person persuades him to let go of that power. Instead, he takes whatever core of humanity still remains within him and he hides it in the warp. That's the origin of the Star Child plot. And then he goes to fight Horus without his power-ups, in the knowledge that he's likely to lose, even if he kills Horus. He has excised those precious human aspects to further steel himself against the pain of what will come after and the mandatory atrocities he will have to countenance in order to rebuild the Imperium. He has set those frail and cardinal virtues adrift on the tide of the Empyrean so that they will not immobilize him, and in the hope that one day he'll be able to reclaim them and be whole again. I watch that jettisoned fragment as it drifts into the void, just one more spark from this world bonfire. All his hope, his mercy, his grace, his love, cast into the lightless tracts of space and time. And That's what happens. The Dark King is avoided, Horus dies, and the Emperor is so wounded that he has to be permanently installed on the Golden Throne, unable to influence his Imperium except through vague psychic visions, and where after 10,000 years he seems to have split back into the thousands of separate voices and personalities he started out as in 8000 BC. Rabute Gilliman, the raging tempest, spoke his name, and it was as the violence a dying sun rains upon its worlds. Gilliman, Gilliman, Gilliman. The name echoed down the wind of eternity, never ceasing, never reaching its intended point. The sensation of many minds reached out to Gilliman, violating his senses as they tried to commune, but then one mind seemed to come from the many, a raw, unbounded power, and gave wordless commands to go out and save what they built together, to destroy what they made, to save his brothers, to kill them. Contradictory impulses, all impossible to disobey, all the same, all different. Right. So, as far as we can tell from the books, that's what we know happened, and that's what the Emperor's plan was. We know that this great plan, the gamble made by the Emperor and Malcador, didn't work out totally as intended, but was it wrong? If you go trawling the internet, you'll come across a load of opinions and theories about all this, most of which can't actually be proven with actual lore. One of the main issues is that a lot of the above is told to us by the Emperor, and we know that the Emperor has no problem lying or misleading people if it gets the job done. Also, some of the stuff that isn't told to us by the Emperor is told to us by people who have their own grievances and opinions. Erda is hardly a neutral source. So, is any of that true? At the time of the Unification Wars, many other rulers on Terra think that the whole guiding humanity for millennia story is made up, and the Emperor is just a bioweapon created in the Age of Strife. But we have All Person, who knew him back in ancient times. We have a couple of myths of ancient times, a couple of things where it seems other people said he was definitely there, so we know that that theory isn't true. But was the Emperor just a tyrant who wanted to be in charge all along, who spun all these tales for personal gain so that he could become a god? That's something you often see on the internet, but if that's the case, it seems like he had a lot of time to do that between being Alexander the Great and the Age of Strife. In Horus Rising, a demon of chaos tells Horus that the Emperor's intention was to destroy religion in order that he could become the only god. But that demon at the time is very obviously lying to Horus about the way things will turn out if Horus rebels against the Emperor. And we do see the Emperor turn down the chance to become the Dark King later on, so that seems unlikely too. Generally, by what we know in the lore, it certainly seems that the Emperor and Malcador believe their plan, that this is the only or the best chance humanity has. And when we see characters in the Horus Heresy who have split from him, Erda, Ol, John Grammaticus, their usual complaint isn't that his plan is wrong, it's the hubris, the arrogance of what he's doing. This plan is just so big and requires so much conquest that it's distasteful. Or, more subtly, that the Emperor is hubristic because he thinks he knows the one true path, when in fact, nobody knows what will happen in the future, and so they eventually get sick of that and leave. But I think nothing in the lore actually suggests the Emperor is actively lying. The only people who say that are chaos demons trying to tempt Primarchs to their side. From what we see, the Emperor and Malcador, rightly or wrongly, are sincere. They believe their plan is true. Whether it is a different question. So, based on what we know happens, is that a reasonable belief? Let's start with the very simplest part of this, the argument that without a military machine the size of the Imperium, ruthlessly uniting humanity at gunpoint, humanity would be destroyed by aliens. Alright, what do we know? Well, the Imperium embarks on the Great Crusade in a number of expeditionary fleets led by the 20 legions, and they come into contact with various human enclaves that have survived the Age of Strife. We know that a lot of them join the Imperium pretty quickly, without conflict, either happy to be reunited or maybe fearful of the strength of the Imperium's armies, and those are obviously underrepresented a bit in the books. And then there are loads that either refuse to join or just attack the Imperium. or are mutated in some way and thus are destroyed by the Imperium. No human empire we encounter in the books wins. Most are defeated by less than one legion. A few are defeated without any legions at all, and some take detachments from a few legions working together to overcome, but no human empire we see in the books is anywhere near as militarily strong as the Imperium. We can't say the same for the aliens, though. While the majority of alien species we see are overcome just as easily as the other humans, there are two major aggressive, expansionist alien species that are a genuine threat to the Imperium: the Orcs and the Rangda. The Orcs are a simple one. Pretty much as soon as the warp storms come down, the Orcs seem to be everywhere. They're the species the Imperium encounters most often across the galaxy, and it's not until the climactic fall of War-Urg at Ullanor, almost 200 years into the Crusade, that the Emperor finally thinks the Great Crusade is on the home stretch, and it's safe for him to go back to his lab and work on the Webway project. The Orcs are described in every way as being a major problem. The Rangda are a little bit more interesting. The Rangdan Empire was a Xenos empire in the galactic northeast that were a major threat to the Imperium in its first century. We don't know very much about them other than that they used horrific technology to enslave the populations of worlds they conquered, and that they were aggressive and expansionist. The Imperium fought 3 wars against them, known as the Rangdan Xenocides, and they almost lost. Whole legions were lost fighting the Rangda, and we know that the strongest legions of the early Crusade were reduced massively, almost under strength after it. Different legions became the primary ones after the Rangdan Xenocides. Interestingly, the Rangda are also described in similar ways to Enuncia or the Warp, as maybe just knowing about them's dangerous. The Space Wolves end up purging human worlds of the taint of the Rangda for decades afterwards. There is a fan theory I've seen around a bit that the Rangda were in fact a rival human empire that was way nicer than the Imperium, and then Primarchs defected to it because it was nicer, and that's actually why it was so dangerous. And the existence of that knowledge is what needed purging. But there's nothing in the lore that actually supports that. It's a fan theory. The Rangda are not only described as kind of horrific and alien, they're also friends with aliens like the Sloth, who are horrific. So that sort of implies they're not a benevolent empire. Given what we know about all the different human enclaves that existed at the time, the Interrex, the Alambic Quietude, the Earth of 6319, it seems very clear that none of them would be a match for the Rangda or the Orcs of 30k, both of which are very clearly expanding. None of them can stand against the Imperium, and the Imperium barely wins against the Rangda. Maybe another human empire or great alliance might have arisen that could have united humanity, one that isn't as bad as the Imperium, but again, we see no evidence of that actually happening. Most of the human enclaves that the Imperium encounters don't really even know the warp storms have stopped, or they don't have warp capability anyway, or they don't have the resources to do what the Imperium does. I think without the Imperium happening, the Rangda or the Orcs would have won. That process might have taken ages. The Imperium is still discovering lost human colonies in the 41st millennium, but without the Imperium or something equally powerful, it's reasonable to assume you'd eventually end up with an alien-dominated galaxy, with the scattered remnants of humanity existing isolated from each other and being slowly picked off over the next few millennia. We don't know what else might have happened. Other things could have happened, but from the position of 30k, I think that is a reasonable assumption. Okay, so we know there were definitely some big alien empires that were very much a threat, but was the Emperor right to kill all the aliens? The general policy of the Imperium is that all Xenos must be wiped out to preserve the best chance for humanity. If humans are in charge of the galaxy with no competition, then they're free to concentrate on becoming a psychic species, essentially doing an Eldar without actually doing an Eldar. So is that correct? Okay, that one's a bit harder to answer. The majority of alien species in the galaxy of 40k or 30k seem to be quite innately hostile, and so they do constitute a threat. But then the Imperium definitely wipes out loads of Xenos species that either pose no threat or just want to be left alone, or ones that actually seem quite friendly, like the Kinnabrak, who are part of the Interrex. The Emperor's reasoning here is basically that aliens can't be trusted, at least not long term, and the thing is, we don't know if that's true or not. In both 40k and 30k, most of the Xenos species we hear about have a very good reason to be hostile to humans, because the humans want to kill them. But also, the few examples we do have of aliens working with each other also seems to be very unreliable. The Cabal of 30k fracture apart, and in 40k, the Tau are the closest example we have, and their empire has a definite, brainwashy second-class citizen vibe going on. In-world, the only people who have a perspective long enough to make a judgment on this, people who were around before the Age of Strife and witnessed humanity's long history with aliens, are some of the Perpetuals, like Erda and Ol. They might have an opinion, but they never mention it. Or the Emperor, whose opinion is that trusting aliens is a bad idea. We don't have another opinion to counter that with. But those questions come down to another choice the Emperor makes. Can the Imperium just not be nicer? Instead of a conquering warlord, could the Emperor not have stayed in the shadows and manipulated things from behind the scenes, just like he had for thousands of years? Create a sort of benevolent space UN. When encountering non-hostile aliens, just ignore them, attack only when provoked, engage in diplomacy with humans who don't want to join, and then, if they really don't want to join, leave them be. Can't the Imperium seek to unite humanity, more nicely? Alright, back to practicalities here. It seems from descriptions that the Unification Wars, that Strife-era terror, with its horrific warlords, evil sorcerers, and gene-twisted ethnarchs, might not have been so receptive to a sort of democratic UN trying to unite it. The place frequently sounds like it belongs in Mad Max or Conan the Barbarian, and from all accounts, being the sort of warlord who could mass-produce things like Thunder Warriors and lead giant fist-fighting armies as a figurehead was kind of the standard way of doing things in the Age of Strife. Alliances with those warlords seems a bit unlikely, at least in the time frame the Emperor is working with. But I guess that doesn't mean that United Terror couldn't then have become a more diplomatic force once it spread into the galaxy. The question is, would that have provided the level of resources needed? We know that the Imperium that did happen, the Emperor's Imperium, was a completely militaristic society that made its priority the folding in of any and all human-controlled resources, including military power and ancient weapons, as quickly as possible, and then use that to try and wipe out the Xenos. And as I just mentioned, even that was barely enough to win against some Xenos empires. I think it's probably fair to assume that if humanity had controlled less military power, fewer planets, or hadn't amassed its strength as quickly through, long negotiation of membership, or had a structure that allowed individual systems to vote on their involvement in a particular war, or choose not to commit all their forces to the Crusade, well then they would be in more danger of losing, right? And apart from the loss of resources, the other problem with letting human enclaves stay out is that they're dangers in and of themselves. The goal of all this is the psychic evolution of humanity, something that is going to happen anyway, but without some sort of guidance and control, risks humanity just doing an Eldar. Their newfound psychic power getting so out of control, they end up getting eaten by demons and maybe forming another Eye of Terror. The Emperor's view is that even knowledge of the warp is potentially dangerous and corrupting, and so that knowledge has to be carefully controlled, and he very much operates on a need-to-know basis about that. Even the Primarchs are considered not important enough to be informed about it. They have one job, and it's real space conquest. Don't ask about the warp. And we know that most of that is true from the rest of 40k. We know the warp's dangerous and that unchecked psychic power is dangerous, and that worshipping chaos and the warp, or having random road psychers, is a great way to eventually see your planet and any nearby planets getting eaten by demons. We know that chaos is corrupting, and people can be lured into worshipping it stage by stage without realizing what's happening. All those concepts are pretty well established in the setting, so the Emperor is right about them. And obviously, leaving human planets to decide if they want to be part of the Imperium is then a massive risk. Psychic instances are increasing, so that planet is an ever-increasing risk of doing their own Eldar and destroying whatever bits of the Imperium are nearby. Now, we are given a couple of examples in the books that seem on the surface to contradict this. The Interrex are very aware of the warp, so much so that they leave one of the most powerful demon weapons in the setting in a museum, which suggests that, with the proper teaching about the warp, humans can see it more rationally as a dangerous thing that should be avoided. But the Interrex also have whole areas of their planets that seem to be demon-haunted caves where the rebellious locals still engage in their old folk beliefs, so it doesn't bloody work. Prospero was a planet of psychers who seem to be mostly plagued not by the Chaos Gods, but by other warp entities, Psychnoian. But while they have a much more holistic approach to the warp, they were still slowly being wiped out until the arrival of Magnus, who solved all their problems by being tricked into a bargain with Tzeentch. So that wasn't ideal either. And societies like the Wordbearers, home planet of Colchis, actively worship the Chaos Pantheon, but seem to be pretty stable for thousands of years. On the other hand, I don't think any of us would look at Colchis and the Wordbearers and assume there was no way they'd ever fall to chaos. We're given some examples about ways in which people deal with the warp differently, but none of them seem to be a foolproof long-term strategy for the evolution of humanity, especially as humanity gets more and more psychic. Now, if we're asking the question, was the Emperor correct? Was his plan actually necessary? Then I would say everything in the lore suggests the answer is yes. Given the events we witness in the books, if the Imperium hadn't existed, hadn't conquered Terra, hadn't unified as much military might, recovered as much technology, gathered as many resources as quickly as possible, then one of the other Xenos powers would have won. And that would put humanity in a very precarious position, especially regarding safely evolving it into a psychic species. And in order to achieve that, the Emperor needed to create super soldiers and super generals to lead them, and doing that required stealing power from the warp, which seems to have put the Emperor on an even more strict time limit regarding his ability to remain human. I don't think the lore gives us a way out. We know that the Emperor was always trying to speed up the development of humanity, at least that's what Erda says, but it seems pretty clear that the birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Eldar and the sudden clearing of the warp storms kind of forced his hand. If he'd waited calmly on Earth for humanity to naturally re-establish itself, if he'd slowed down his plans in any way, there's a pretty good chance humanity would have been eaten by the Rangda or defeated by the Orcs, or that individual systems would do an Eldar and fall apart in psychic overload. And we should point out that even despite the Horus heresy, this plan does mostly work. Humanity does become the dominant force in the galaxy, fighting lots of wars, but not really existentially threatened by alien species for the next 10,000 years. It's only in the 41st millennium, when Tyranids and Necrons show up, and when Abaddon creates the Great Rift, that there are any actual existential threats to humanity. There's already a fair amount of speculation in this for one of my videos, but I think any other explanation involves even more speculation. I think the history of the Horus Heresy, all these books, basically confirm that the Emperor and Malcador were right to have a sense of urgency about this, and that humanity really was in danger of being destroyed if they didn't do their plans. Is that disappointing? Would we prefer it if the Emperor's plans were just wrong? If he's just an evil tyrant? I mean, that'd certainly make the morality of 40k simpler, right? The Emperor's evil. But I think that actually, for 40k to work as well as it does, the Emperor's plans have to be correct. Usually, when people talk about how horrible the Emperor is, they mention the obvious things, right? He is an authoritarian tyrant. He's a dictator. He kills millions of humans and aliens in pursuit of his goals. He's also a liar, and he's often referred to as a hypocrite. He doesn't tell his subordinates, people like the Primarchs, the full truth about his plans. And in Valdor, during the Palace coup, we see that the Lex Imperia, the law of the Imperium, seems not to apply to him or his mates. All of those things are definitely true. The Emperor is horrible. And we can compare that to our own history. Human history has a string of authoritarian dictators who initiated massive wars or murdered millions of people, all in the promise that what they were doing was 100% totally necessary, that once their grand, bloody plans had happened, everyone would be better off afterwards. Many of those dictators even believed what they were doing. They were sincere, at least at first. And millions of people died as a result of those grand plans, which then usually turned out to be wrong. Their plans did not make everything better at the end. The dictator and their immediate family usually ended up being really filthy rich and living a life of questionable luxury, while their people's lives got way worse. And it's tempting to just walk away from 40k with that as the lesson, right? Look what happens when you let an authoritarian dictator win. But of course, the Emperor's right. So we have to look at the other side too. Even when we think war is justified, the leaders and governments who do it still do many of those things, right? About the only war in recent history that most people would agree was justified was the Allied resistance to the Axis powers in World War II. But even the Allied powers restricted people's freedoms, conscripted them into armies, which were then marched into battle in the knowledge that many of them would die. They used propaganda, lied to their own population, they hid details of specific operations from their own side, even high-ranking members of their own side. They restricted information to those who needed to know. They instituted temporary draconian laws that sometimes didn't apply to people sufficiently senior. When we talk about wars, we accept that that stuff is sometimes necessary. It'd be childish to argue that fighting the Nazis was morally wrong because it involved lying to people, and lying is bad. Churchill was a bad dad, so you shouldn't support the war. That seems silly. Warhammer is a war game, its background is about wars, and the Emperor's story mirrors the fundamental question we ask about wars in the real world. How much immorality is allowed to achieve something you think is moral? It's a trolley problem, right? Would you do an immoral thing if the results were likely to save more people? All right then, how many would you do? Where's the line? What if it was only slightly likely to save more people? In order to create a narrative where that question exists, to create that grey area where interesting stories happen, you need a realistically achievable moral goal and a load of immoral actions you have to do to get there. And then you can weigh them up and find all your uncomfortable situations, the meat of the story. And the Emperor's plan in 40k is the realistic moral goal. If the Imperium weren't justified at all, if the Emperor was just lying or incorrect, just an evil tyrant who's wrong, I think the setting would be less interesting. On the flip side, if every single thing he did was justified, that'd be boring too. There are people out there whose reaction to trolley problems is just utilitarianism, or who treat fiction like membership of a sports team. I'm a human, so anything is justified if it means the fictional space humans win. That's also boring. That's a Saturday morning cartoon in terms of morals. In order to be interesting, the truth needs to be in this weird grey area in the middle. It's much more easier to see that when you look at the setting of Warhammer 40k. In 40k, the Imperium really does need to fight wars of survival. Millions of conscripted soldiers drafted to fight against swarms of Tyranids, exterminatus to stop demonic possession and warp rifts. We understand that the Imperium's battle for survival is sometimes needed, but we also understand that this has made the Imperium so hidebound and dogmatic that it also fights wars out of basically tradition or martial honour. It wastes millions of lives for no gain at all, or sacrifices planets because of inefficiency. And that one thing feeds the other. It's a world where you can have an honest Imperial character fighting for the survival of their friends, and evil tyrants slaughtering millions out of tradition, and the truth is like somewhere in the middle. Those grey areas are just slightly different when we're talking about the Great Crusade or the Horus Heresy. Do you really need your soldiers to wipe out every single Xenos like a frothing zealot just in case? What if imposing a blanket rule like that, while certainly efficient, means that your soldiers start to enjoy it? What if you need to create an army or a general so horrible and brutal that they can have no place in the empire you're building? Do you kill them afterwards? Is that justified? What happens when you can't actually tell people the real reason they're doing all these things, so they start to speculate and invent their own reasons or their own better ways of doing things? What happens if you can't tell them the truth? What happens when your plan cannot possibly be delayed to fix anything that goes wrong? Was the Emperor's plan correct? Well, according to everything we can see from the lore, broadly, yeah. His plan was a long shot. It didn't completely work out, thanks Horus, but it seems that without the Emperor doing what he did, humanity would be at considerably greater risk of being destroyed or of destroying itself. That is what the lore says. Does that mean it's morally right? Well, that's the same question we ask any time a war comes up. And the whole point of 40k is that you can't answer it. What's acceptable? How far is too far? These are questions raised constantly in the lore. The theme of many war narratives is to ask, at what cost? At what cost was winning achieved? Was it worth it? That question would be robbed of all its meaning if it turned out the goal was pointless all along. The Emperor's plans being right allows Warhammer to do that, to contrast the apparent requirement, the morality of that goal, with the reality of what had to be done to achieve it. And I think that horror, that tragedy, makes it a more interesting setting to tell all these stories in. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more, there should be a video popping up in just a second. In the meantime, look, there's a merch store. Why don't you go and get some merch? Links in the thing below. Or of course you can like and subscribe, or you can become a member on Patreon or YouTube memberships and join in with Taylor for Gamers or get early access to videos. See ya!